Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we take your sources, articles, research notes, and really dig into them to pull out the key insights just for you.
Exactly.
Today, we're plunging into a topic that, well, it shapes who we are at our very core, identity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're like our listener today, coming from elementary education, you're probably super curious about human development, right? Especially how we become, us.
Absolutely. That developmental piece is huge.
So for you, our big question today is, how does someone's ethnic background really shape their sense of self and their overall well-being?
That's the core of it. And you should think of this deep dive as, well, kind of a shortcut. It's a way to get a handle on a really complex, but honestly critical area of psychology.
Okay.
We're going to sift through some key research on ethnic identity. We'll focus particularly on ethnic minority groups here in the U.S. The goal is to pull out the most important insights for someone like you.
Someone working with kids every day.
Exactly. Someone interacting with developing minds constantly. So understanding this stuff, it's invaluable.
Yeah.
And our foundation here is solid. It's a big chapter from a major handbook on identity theory. So we're getting right into the academic heart of it.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're talking about ethnic identity, which is, it's fascinating, right? And often deeply personal.
So personal.
Our mission today is basically to equip you with a much richer understanding of this whole concept. What are the theories behind it? What does the research actually show? And crucially, why is it so incredibly relevant for the kids you'll work with, especially, in diverse classrooms?
Right. So just to set the stage a bit, ethnic identity is one component, a really vital piece of a person's overall identity.
Okay.
And its salience, like how central or important it feels to you, that can vary a lot from person to person.
Right. Not everyone feels it the same way.
Not at all. And in a country like the U.S., which is, this incredible mix of histories and cultures, but also, unfortunately, a place with ongoing disparities linked to ethnicity, well, this part of identity becomes particularly crucial.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're really zeroing in on how this aspect of identity can act as what researchers call a promotive or protective factor for psychosocial functioning.
Promotive or protective, what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, how it helps people thrive. Not just cope, but actually flourish in their social and emotional lives. How it helps them, navigate social stuff, manage their feelings, build a healthy sense of who they are.
Got it. So let's start at the beginning. What is ethnic identity, really? And why should we care so much about it? It's definitely not just ticking a box on a form.
Oh, definitely not. It's much deeper. At its core, ethnic identity is the identity that develops from belonging to an ethnic group. It's rooted really deeply in your culture of origin. That's how the key researchers define it.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, some people thought of it simply as like a label, saying I'm Chinese American or I'm Mexican American.
It's just self-identification.
Exactly. But researchers, especially more recently, have really moved away from that simplistic view. Now it's seen as much more multifaceted, much more complex. Identity isn't static, it's layered, it's dynamic.
But why does that shift matter? Why is just the label not enough?
Well, what's fascinating and really important is that reducing it to just a label totally misses all the crucial differences within groups.
Oh, okay.
Like it overlooks someone's deep sense of attachment or their commitment to their group, and critically, how much they've actually explored their heritage.
Right.
Think about it this way. In your classroom, you could have two students who both identify as, say, Mexican American,
Okay.
but they could have vastly different degrees of ethnic identity. One might be really connected to family traditions, the language, the history. Maybe they participate in cultural events. The other might have, maybe a more superficial connection. Maybe they don't know much about their family's background.
And that difference matters for them.
Hugely. That variability is often tied to how well they adjust psychologically and socially. That connection they feel and how deep it runs, that can really shape the impact their group membership has on their sense of self, their confidence, their well-being.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It's the lived experience, the feeling inside, not just the category. And this links directly to the U.S. context, right? This land of immigrants idea.
Exactly.
Our sources point out this country has always put a lot of emphasis on ethnicity. But the flip side, the really unfortunate reality, is massive disparities and a long, painful history of discrimination based on ethnicity.
Precisely. And because of that specific socio-historical backdrop, ethnic group membership often becomes especially salient, like really prominent and central for ethnic minority individuals here, often more so than for their European American white counterparts.
And this isn't just theory, right? This plays out in real life. for real kids.
Oh, absolutely. It has profound real-world implications, things that directly impact the students you'll encounter.
So for you, thinking about your classroom,
Right.
imagine how this plays out. You might have students from ethnic minority backgrounds who are constantly navigating messages about their ethnicity, messages that are totally different from what their white peers might be getting.
Right.
Maybe their family speaks another language at home, or they celebrate different holidays. They might see negative stereotypes thrown around in the media or experience those subtle digs, those microaggressions.
Or even outright discrimination.
Exactly, outside of school. Understanding that bigger picture helps you, as their teacher, see their experiences more fully. It helps you be more sensitive to the unique pressures they might be facing, pressures that can absolutely impact their learning, their focus, their sense of belonging in your classroom.
And this leads us right to why ethnic identity is so practically important. It can function as a protective factor.
Protective, how so?
Well, we know that ethnic minority individuals in the U.S. are, unfortunately, disproportionately likely to face negative stuff linked to their ethnicity, like discrimination.
Right.
And those experiences can lead to really negative outcomes like anxiety, depression, stress. So identifying things that can protect against those negative impacts or even promote positive functioning despite adversity, that's absolutely crucial.
Wow, so if a child is facing discrimination, having a strong connection to their ethnic identity could actually act as a buffer, like shield them somehow.
That's exactly the idea. It can be like a built-in resilience mechanism,
Yeah.
a source of strength.
That's really powerful.
It is, and that's why scholars and even major public health bodies like the U.S. Surgeon General have called for more prevention research focused specifically on factors like ethnic identity.
To prevent negative outcomes.
Exactly, to minimize things like delinquency, school failure, mental health problems, things that ethnic minority youth are often at higher risk for, sadly, due to those systemic disadvantages and discrimination.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting for you as an educator. Imagine having a tool, something that could help a child navigate tricky social situations, build up that resilience, maybe overcome challenges linked to prejudice. That's basically what a strong ethnic identity can be. It's like a protective shield, an inner resource. So what makes up this shield? What are the actual building blocks?
That's the perfect next question. To understand how ethnic identity forms and what it's actually made of, we need to look at the foundational theories. And one of the biggest influences comes from Erikson's theory of identity development back in the 60s.
Right, Erikson. Identity crisis, adolescence.
Yeah.
That rings a bell.
Exactly. And then James Marcia in the 80s and 90s, he took Erikson's ideas and made them more concrete, operationalized them.
So Erikson had the big idea, identity formation is this critical task across our lives, and Marcia broke it down.
Kind of. Marcia outlined 4 identity statuses: diffuse, foreclosed, moratorium, and achieved. These basically classify people based on whether they've explored identity issues and whether they've committed to a personal identity.
Okay. Exploration and commitment.
Those are the key ingredients. Now, when we apply this to ethnic identity, we're looking at similar processes: searching, exploring, and then settling, committing.
Can you give a classroom analogy? Make it concrete.
Sure. Think about a student exploring different clubs or subjects. Maybe they tried debate club, then the art club. Maybe they explore different types of music. That's exploration.
Right. Trying things out.
Then eventually maybe they find they really love art, they commit to it, it becomes a passion. That's commitment. Ethnic identity development can be like that, a journey of exploration and eventually, hopefully, commitment. It's not a fixed point.
Okay, that helps. And then researchers like Finney took those ideas and applied them specifically to ethnicity, especially in adolescence.
Yes, exactly. Finney developed a really influential multi-component model. The first key component is exploration.
Which is?
Actively trying to understand more about your ethnic group, increasing your exposure. So maybe reading books about your group's history, talking to family members or elders about traditions, asking questions, even searching online. It's an active seeking out of information.
Okay, so in the classroom, an example might be a student picks their family's country of origin for a history project.
Perfect example.
Or they interview their grandparents about coming to the U.S., or they research traditional holidays their family celebrates. That's them actively digging in, right? Learning about their roots.
Precisely. They're gathering info, asking questions, seeking experiences. And then the second component Finney highlights is commitment or resolution.
Okay. Commitment resolution. What's that about?
This is about feeling a sense of, well, Resolution about your ethnic group membership. It's understanding what it means to you personally. How important is it in your life? It's that feeling of clarity, of being settled and comfortable with that part of your identity.
So for that student doing the history project, the feeling of belonging to that heritage, understanding why those traditions matter to them, feeling sort of settled about it, that's the resolution part.
Exactly. It's that internal sense of clarity and significance.
Okay, exploration and resolution. Got it. Is there a third piece?
Yes, the third major theoretical influence comes from social identity theory. This comes more from sociology and social psychology. And it puts a real emphasis on the emotional connection, the effect you have toward your ethnic group.
The feelings part.
Exactly. This is where we get the idea of ethnic identity affirmation, sometimes called private regard.
Affirmation. So how positively or negatively you feel about your group?
Pretty much. The core idea from social identity theory is that we all strive for positive social identity because it helps us maintain a positive self-concept, feel good about ourselves.
Makes sense.
So one way to do that is by feeling positively about the groups we belong to. Ethnic identity affirmation is about that positive versus negative feeling. Do you feel pride, connection, or maybe indifference, or even shame?
Okay, let's bring this back to the classroom again. An example for our listeners.
Sure. Imagine a school celebrates diverse cultural holidays. Maybe they have a multicultural fair where students share food or music from their heritage.
Okay.
If a student sees their culture represented, maybe their classmates are interested and respectful, and they feel this sense of pride, this positive connection, that's affirmation happening.
Right. They feel seen and valued.
Exactly. But the flip side, if their culture is constantly ignored or maybe made fun of their accent, their food is called weird, stereotypes are thrown around.
That would crush that positive feeling.
It absolutely can. It negatively impacts affirmation. It might make them feel less positive, maybe even ashamed, maybe wanting to hide that part of themselves.
Wow. So these three things, exploration, resolution, affirmation, they're the building blocks.
They're the key components most researchers focus on now. And when you see ethnic identity as this social developmental process, theory suggests it becomes increasingly important during adolescence. That's when the big identity questions really come up.
But it doesn't just stop after high school.
Oh, definitely not. It's considered a salient process throughout the entire lifespan. We revisit these questions at different points in our lives.
So what's the upshot of all this? What does a strong, well-developed ethnic identity do for someone?
Well, the research strongly suggests that having a secure sense of ethnic identity, likely involving exploration, resolution, and affirmation, contributes significantly to positive psychosocial functioning among ethnic minority individuals.
So it helps them adjust better, cope better.
Yes, it really serves as an important predictor of overall well-being and development. It helps build that resilience we talked about, helps them adapt positively to life's challenges. Now, most of the research has focused on teens.
Okay.
But the general finding is pretty clear. Ethnic identity tends to promote positive adjustment, though, as we'll see, the specifics can definitely vary depending on the ethnic group we're talking about.
Okay, that's the perfect lead-in. Let's get into what the research actually shows. We've got the theory, the components. Now for the evidence.
Right. But first, a really important caveat. A lot of the early research tended to pool different ethnic minority groups together.
Meaning
They'd combine, say, Black, Latino, and Asian participants into one big ethnic minority sample and analyze the data all together.
Okay, and what did that pooled data generally show?
Generally, when samples are pooled like that, higher levels of ethnic identity, whether it's strong affirmation, active exploration, solid resolution, or just a combined score, those are usually linked with good things.
Like what?
Like lower drug use, higher self-esteem, better overall quality of life, even lower levels of things like impulsivity or rebelliousness. So a generally positive picture.
Okay, seems good. But I'm guessing there's a but. Pooling sounds like it might hide things.
Exactly. There's a significant but. While those general findings are positive, pooling samples like that can totally mask important differences. Differences between ethnic groups and even within them.
Like the apple and banana thing you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. It lumps everyone together. We really need to look at specific groups to get a clearer, more accurate picture.
Okay, let's do that. Let's dig into the specifics, group by group. How about we start with Latino samples? What does the research show there?
Okay, so research with Latino samples paints, well, a more mixed and complex picture compared to that pooled data.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, many studies do show positive links. A strong ethnic identity has been tied to higher self-esteem in adolescence, better coping skills, a sense of mastery, optimism.
Okay, those sound good.
Yeah. And specifically, exploration and resolution that searching and settling have been uniquely linked to higher self-esteem in Latino high schoolers and college students. And affirmation that positive feeling has been linked to lower delinquency.
So mostly positive then.
And importantly, affirmation also seems to act as that protective buffer sometimes. It can lessen the negative hit on self-esteem when someone experiences discrimination. It can even buffer against risks like peer drug use. So yeah, lots of studies suggest it's a real strength.
Okay, but you said mixed picture, so where's the complication?
The complication comes from a number of studies that actually found ethnic identity linked with increased maladjustment among some Latino groups.
Wait, increased, like worse outcomes?
Yeah, surprisingly. For example, some research found stronger ethnic identity linked to higher alcohol or marijuana use in certain college and teen samples.
Huh. Why would that be?
It's not entirely clear. Maybe group norms, maybe stress related to identity in certain contexts. Also, for some younger Latino adolescents, exploration was sometimes tied to increased delinquency and affirmation to increased alcohol use.
That's counterintuitive.
And perhaps the most striking finding, one study found that experiencing prejudice was linked to more depressive symptoms for those Latino college students who were highly ethnically identified.
Whoa. So the strong identity, the thing we thought was a shield, actually made the prejudice hit harder for them.
It seems so in that context. It acted more like a risk enhancer than a protective factor.
That is a critical and honestly kind of shocking insight for an educator. How could that even happen?
It's complex. Maybe for highly identified folks, prejudice feels like a deeper, more personal attack on their core self. Maybe they internalize it more, or maybe it's that poor fit idea, strong identity in a hostile environment creates stress.
Okay.
And then just to add to the mix, some studies found no significant link at all between ethnic identity and things like depressive symptoms in Latino teens.
So it really is complicated for Latino youth.
It is. Exploration and resolution seem pretty consistently good for adjustment. But affirmation, it's more nuanced. It depends on the context, especially how prejudice plays out.
Okay, so for you as an educator, this means if you have a highly identified Latino student, yes, their identity is likely a huge strength. But be aware, they might also feel the sting of prejudice more acutely sometimes. They might need extra support, extra sensitivity.
Well put.
Now let's shift to Black samples. You mentioned the findings there are often more consistently positive.
Yes, that's generally true. The research looking at ethnic identity and psychosocial functioning among Black samples has, much more consistently, shown these promotive effects. It really seems to act as a positive force.
So fewer negative or mixed findings.
Far fewer. I mean, among the studies we reviewed for this, only one showed affirmation linked to increased delinquency, which really stands out as an outlier. Generally, for Black early adolescents, a strong ethnic identity is consistently linked with fewer externalizing behaviors like acting out and lower risky sexual attitudes.
Okay.
It's also tied to lower aggression, fewer depressive symptoms, less loneliness, and importantly, higher self-esteem. Pretty consistent across the board.
And what about the individual components exploration affirmation for Black youth? Same positive story.
Absolutely. When you break it down, you see similar positive trends. Exploration was linked to lower delinquency. Affirmation was linked to fewer risky sexual behaviors, more positive attitudes towards school, fewer general behavior problems.
That school attitude link is huge for educators.
It is. And internally, affirmation was positively linked with self-esteem across different adolescent stages and negatively linked with depressive symptoms. Exploration and resolution were also tied to higher self-esteem in Black college students.
So it sounds like for Black youth, ethnic identity isn't just generally positive, it's like a really significant, powerful protective factor. It builds resilience.
It really seems to be. Consistent with some of the Latino findings, affirmation pops up again as a significant protective factor against drug and alcohol use. It even seemed to reduce the link between depression and suicidal thoughts among Black college students in one study.
Wow.
And maybe most critically, a strong connection to their ethnic group was found to buffer or reduce the negative impact of discrimination on things like academic achievement, self-competence, and problem behaviors.
So it literally helps protect their grades and self-worth from the effects of racism.
That's what the research suggests. A strong ethnic identity can be a powerful shield against those damaging impacts, helping Black youth stay on track academically and emotionally.
Okay, the message here seems really clear then. For Black youth, a strong ethnic identity consistently links to positive outcomes and acts as that powerful buffer. This is a huge takeaway for any educator. Affirming and supporting this identity isn't just nice, it's genuinely impactful. It provides a vital source of strength.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, next up. The group you said has perhaps the most complex findings, Asian samples.
Yes, indeed. Research with Asian samples gets tricky. For one thing, many studies here actually focus on specific national origin groups like Filipinos, Koreans, Cambodians, rather than just the broad Asian American label.
Which makes sense given the diversity.
Exactly. And interestingly, unlike other groups, several studies have actually looked at adult Asian samples too, not just youth. But the findings, they appear even more mixed than what we saw with Latinos.
More mixed how? More negatives? More inconsistencies?
Both. Paradoxically, several studies actually linked higher ethnic identity with greater maladjustment for some specific groups.
Wait, greater, like the risk enhancer idea again?
Kind of. Higher ethnic identity scores were tied to more delinquency among Cambodian adolescents and more misconduct and even suicide attempts among Native Hawaiian adolescents in Hawaii. These are really concerning findings, quite different from the overall pattern for Black youth, for example.
That's a stark contrast. Any theories why?
It likely points to that immense diversity within the Asian category. Specific immigration histories, how different groups were received, acculturation pressures, unique forms of discrimination. They probably all play a role. It's not one single story.
But it wasn't all negative, right?
No, not at all. Other studies found positives. Affirmation was linked to lower violence among Hawaiian adolescents and adults. And in broader Asian samples, strong ethnic identity has been linked to higher self-esteem in high schoolers and lighter depression in college students.
Okay.
Affirmation was also tied positively to self-esteem and negatively to depression for college students. And strong identity linked to fewer depressive symptoms among Filipino adults. So positive links are definitely there too.
But then there were studies showing no link.
Right. One study of Korean college students found no significant association between ethnic identity and either self-esteem or depression. It's just all over the map.
So the big takeaway for Asian samples is extreme caution about generalizing.
Absolutely. This really hammers home a critical point. Asian is a massive, incredibly diverse pan-ethnic umbrella. Unlike many Latino groups who might share Spanish, Asian groups often don't share a common language. Differences in immigration history, why and when they came, cultural traditions, it all means findings for, say, Vietnamese Americans might tell you very little about Japanese Americans.
So for you, as an educator, this means really being aware of the specific cultural background of your Asian American students. Avoid those blanket assumptions. Ask questions. Show interest in their unique heritage.
That's key. Recognizing their specific background is crucial.
And what about that protective role? Did identity buffer against discrimination for Asian samples?
Again, mixed findings. For Filipino adults, yes, ethnic identity did seem to lessen the negative impact of discrimination on depression and even prescription drug use, so protective there. Okay. But another study, using a broader pan-ethnic Asian American college sample, found no evidence of that protective, moderating role for discriminations linked to self-esteem or depression.
Why the difference? Group studied. Age.
Could be either or both. The specific national origin group, Filipino versus broad Asian, or the developmental period, adults versus college students. It just reinforces the need for much more specific research.
You also mentioned something earlier about context mattering a lot for Asian samples, like the ethnic makeup of the school or community.
Yes, that's another really significant factor that emerged. One study found that ethnic identity was linked to lower depression only when Asian American college students were in an ethnically concentrated environment where Asians made up a large part of the population.
But not when they were in mostly white environments.
Exactly. In primarily white American contexts, where Asians were a small minority, that link between ethnic identity and lower depression disappeared.
Wow. So the environment totally changed whether their identity was linked to better mental health.
It seems so. This really highlights that idea of goodness of fit.
Right. Explain that again. How does the fit between identity and environment affect well-being?
If the environment affirms and supports the student's ethnic identity, maybe the school celebrates diversity, the community has others from similar backgrounds, cultural resources are available, that good fit can boost well-being.
Makes sense.
But if there's a poor fit, their culture is ignored, devalued, they face prejudice, they feel isolated as one of only a few, then even a strong internal ethnic identity might not be protective. It might even become a source of stress because the outside world isn't validating that important part of them.
So it's not just having the identity, it's how it interacts with the world around you.
Precisely. The context is critical.
Okay, finally, let's touch briefly on American Indian samples.
Yeah.
You said this group is often underrepresented in research.
Hugely underrepresented, yes. It's a major gap. And the findings we do have are mixed and honestly really difficult to generalize.
Why so different?
Because of the sheer diversity. There are hundreds of distinct tribes, languages, cultural traditions within the American Indian and Alaska Native populations. Lumping them together is even more problematic than with other groups.
So what little research there is, what does it hint at?
Well, some studies have linked affirmation to lower drug use and a strong overall identity to higher self-esteem and fewer social problems. So some positive signals. But, again, complexity. Another study actually linked affirmation to increased drug use among some early adolescents, similar to some of the findings we saw for specific Latino or Asian subgroups.
So not universally positive here either. What's the main message then for American Indian populations?
The critical takeaway is the desperate need for more research. Research that is specific to tribal affiliations, that understands the unique histories and contexts of different nations. The limited and mixed findings we have now, they just don't allow for broad conclusions.
So, for an educator, this means approaching American Indian students with immense humility, a willingness to learn about their specific heritage, acknowledging tribal sovereignty, and recognizing the historical context. No assumptions.
Exactly. Avoid generalizations at all costs.
Okay, let's try to summarize all these empirical findings. Across all the groups, what's the big picture for our listener?
Okay, big picture. Overall, ethnic identity generally seems to serve a positive promotive function. It helps, especially for adolescents and college students.
Okay.
This seems most consistently true for Black groups in the U.S. There, it often acts like that strong protective shield we talked about.
Got it. And least consistent for?
Least consistent for Asian groups. The findings there are really varied, highly dependent on the specific national origin group and the context. For American Indian samples, we just don't have enough specific research to say much definitively beyond acknowledging the huge diversity.
And for Latino samples?
More mixed than for Black samples, but generally leaning positive, especially exploration and resolution. Affirmation is where the nuance comes in, particularly around experiences of prejudice.
And the most important underlying message?
Never assume homogeneity. The diversity among and within ethnic minority groups is immense. Pooled data gives a vague positive signal, but it masks all the crucial differences. We have to look deeper at specific groups and contexts.
Okay. Now that we've surveyed the research landscape, warts and all, let's zoom in on where the field needs to go next, the limitations, the future directions. This is where it gets really practical, thinking about what these gaps mean for individual kids in your classroom.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest limitations, which we've already hinted at strongly, is the need to get serious about within-group diversity, moving beyond those broad pan-ethnic labels.
Right. Stop lumping everyone together.
Exactly. The fact that findings differ so much when you compare pooled samples to ethnically specific samples, that screams the need for analyses by specific ethnic groups and even national origin groups.
So not just Latino, but Mexican-American, Puerto Rican, Cuban-American, Dominican-Americans, each potentially having different identity experiences.
Precisely. Think about it. Our source mentioned differences in immigration history. Cubans arriving in Florida in specific waves versus Mexicans with centuries-long roots in California, or Puerto Ricans in New York versus California. Those contexts create very different meanings for a Latino identity, assuming they're all the same. It just obscures reality. A recent refugee student's experience is vastly different from a third-generation student's.
Okay, huge takeaway for you as an immercator. Don't make assumptions based on broad labels like Asian or Latino. Recognize the incredible diversity within those labels. If appropriate and the student is comfortable, ask about their specific heritage. Show genuine interest. It helps you create a more inclusive, relevant space for every child, meeting them where they actually are.
That's perfectly put. Another limitation is the developmental period studied. Erickson focused heavily on adolescence.
Right. Identity crisis time.
But ethnic identity isn't something you figure out once and you're done. It's revisited, renegotiated throughout life. Yet most research is still on teens. There's a big gap when it comes to adults.
Does it still matter for adults? Does it still protect them?
The limited research we have suggests yes. Some studies on adults show ethnic identity still buffers against discrimination's negative effects, and it's linked to higher quality of life. So its importance endures.
So for you in the classroom, remember you're laying groundwork, the identity development you support in elementary school. That's not the end of the story. You're building foundational blocks for a lifelong process. knowing this identity can protect them later in life, it just reinforces how important it is to nurture it early. What you do matters long term.
A third critical need is for more longitudinal studies, studies that follow the same individuals over time.
To see how identity actually changes and grows.
Exactly. These are tough studies to do, expensive, time-consuming, so there aren't many. But they're crucial for understanding the progression. Do kids move from exploration to resolution? What triggers shifts?
What have the few longitudinal studies found?
They've mainly looked at Black and Latino youth, and they do show significant growth in affirmation and exploration during middle adolescence. But interestingly, even these studies show inconsistencies between different groups.
Why the inconsistencies?
It might be partly due to those community differences, again, the ethnic concentration. Like a study in urban NYC might show different identity growth patterns than one in mostly white Midwestern towns.
So context matters for growth trajectories too.
It seems so. It underscores the need to consider community context when tracking identity development. Thankfully, there are newer statistical methods coming out that can track these changes, these transitions between identity statuses, much better than before, giving us a more dynamic picture.
Okay. So for you as an educator, just like you track reading levels or math skills, realize that a student's ethnic identity is also growing, changing, evolving. Their comfort level might shift as they change schools, make new friends, have new experiences. Being aware of that fluidity helps you stay responsive and supportive through those changes.
Another huge shift in the field, and a limitation of older work, involves moving away from single composite scores for ethnic identity.
You mean just one overall number?
Yeah. Early measures often just gave you one score, lumping exploration, resolution, and affirmation together, but analyses show this basically just measured one general feeling, masking the unique roles of each part.
So newer measures look at them separately: exploration, resolution, affirmation.
Exactly. Measures like the EIS or the MEAR allow us to assess each component individually.
Okay, but why is that separation so important for an educator? How does it change things on the ground?
This is a really crucial nugget for you. It matters because the components link differently to outcomes and predictors. It gives you more specific levers to pull.
For example?
Okay, one study found that what parents do like teaching kids about their heritage, ethnic socialization, that predicted exploration and resolution pretty well.
Yeah.
But it did not predict affirmation.
Whoa. So parents can teach the facts and history, build understanding, but not necessarily instill that deep pride.
Seems that way sometimes. Maybe the pride piece, the affirmation, is more influenced by peer groups, school climate, societal messages.
That's huge. School environment could be key for affirmation. Any other examples?
Yeah. Another study found that affirmation specifically predicted teacher-reported school performance. Not exploration or resolution, just affirmation.
So feeling good about your group might directly link to doing better in school, according to teachers.
That's what that study suggested. And a longitudinal study of Latino youth found that growth in exploration predicted growth in self-esteem later on, but growth in affirmation or resolution didn't in that particular study.
Okay, my head is spinning a bit, but the point is, the pieces matter individually.
Exactly. It means supporting ethnic identity isn't one single action. You need a multi-pronged approach. You can encourage exploration, diverse books, cultural projects, guest speakers. You can foster resolution, create belonging, space for reflection, maybe journaling or sharing circles about heritage. And you boost affirmation, celebrate diversity, ensure kids feel valued, actively counter stereotypes.
And knowing these different links helps target support. Like if a student struggles academically, maybe focusing on boosting their affirmation could be particularly helpful based on that one study.
Precisely. It gives you more targeted, nuanced strategies.
Okay. Makes sense. What else?
Well, related to context again, the role of community ethnic concentration. We need much more systematic research here. How does the social context, not just the school, but the neighborhood, the region, influence identity development and its outcomes?
So living in a diverse city versus a mostly white rural town could make a big difference.
It seems likely. Findings are mixed on how exactly, but it's clear context does affect things. We saw that example where ethnic identity might be protective against substance use in highly Hispanic areas in the Southwest, but a potential risk factor in mostly white areas in the Midwest. It links back to that goodness of fit.
Right. The match between internal identity and external validation.
Exactly. If the community devalues or ignores a student's group, even a strong internal identity might lead to poorer adjustment because of that mismatch, that lack of fit. It creates stress.
So this really informs how you understand your specific students in your specific school. A student in a super diverse city school has a different context than one in a small, homogeneous town. And your job in your classroom is to try and create that goodness of fit within those four walls. Make it a place where all identities are seen, valued, affirmed, regardless of what's outside.
Beautifully said. That's the goal.
Okay, final limitation area.
A final big one is understanding the interface of ethnic identity with other social identities. We aren't just our ethnicity, right?
Right. Gender, sexuality, race, class.
All of it. Our identities are these intersections, but very few studies look at how these multiple identities intersect and develop together. Are the processes similar? Distinct?
Where has most research focused in this area?
Mostly on ethnic identity and gender identity. Some studies found, for instance, that women who had explored and committed to their gender identity also tended to have done the same for their ethnic identity, suggesting the processes might be linked for some people.
Interesting. What about things like performance? Like in school? Can activating different identities affect that?
Absolutely. This is where that fascinating experimental work on stereotype threat comes in.
Okay, refresh my memory on stereotype threat.
It's the idea that being aware of a negative stereotype about your group can actually make you perform worse in a way that confirms the stereotype because you're anxious about fulfilling it.
Right.
So researchers did studies with Asian American college women. In one, making their gender identity salient right before a verbal test. Maybe asking them questions about being a woman led to better performance than making their ethnic identity salient.
Because the stereotype for women on verbal tests might be less negative than for Asians, or vice versa for math.
Exactly. In another study by the same group, making their Asian American identity salient before a math test led to higher scores, while making their gender identity salient led to worse math scores.
Whoa. So activating different parts of their identity literally changed their test scores based on the stereotypes associated with those identities.
That's the finding. And what's wild is it seemed to work for both negative stereotypes, like women and math, and positive stereotypes, like Asians and math. The salient stereotype, positive or negative, seemed to push behavior in line with it.
Okay, this concept of stereotype threat and how priming identities affects performance. This is huge EE for an educator.
Absolutely massive.
It means you have to be incredibly mindful of stereotypes floating around, positive and negative, how you group kids, who you call on for what subject, even throwaway comments. It could unintentionally activate a stereotype and impact a student's confidence and performance.
Precisely. Like always calling on certain kids for math help or making jokes about who's good at art. It seems harmless, but it can trigger these effects.
So the goal is to create an environment where kids feel safe, bringing their whole self, all their identities, without feeling boxed in by stereotypes.
That's the ideal. And one more crucial distinction under this multiple identities umbrella: race versus ethnicity.
Yes. Often used interchangeably, but not the same.
Critically different. Our source really stresses this. Race is generally based on perceived physical characteristics like skin color, and it's often socially and historically constructed. Think about how categories like black and white were created and used in the U.S.
Right, tied to power and history.
Exactly. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is about shared cultural traditions, values, language, history, things passed down generationally. It's often more subjective, more about cultural affiliation.
Could you give that example again, how they overlap or differ?
Sure. Think about Cuban Americans. Some are racially white, some are racially black. They share a Cuban ethnic identity tied to Cuban culture, but their racial experiences in the U.S. might differ significantly based on whether they are perceived as white or black.
Okay. Or the Haitian American and African American example.
Perfect. Both might share a black racial identity in the U.S. context, facing similar societal racism based on that. But their ethnic identities are distinct. Haitian culture, language, history versus African American culture and history. Racial identity is often about navigating that shared experience of oppression or privilege tied to race. Ethnic identity is more about connection to cultural roots.
And you mentioned race might be more central for some groups than others.
Scholars suggest that, yeah, race might be particularly salient for Black individuals in the U.S. because of the deep history of racial stratification. It might be less salient for some Latino groups who don't neatly fit into U.S. racial boxes and might identify more strongly with their nationality or ethnicity.
But people navigate both, right, this intersection?
Absolutely. That Black Haitian American student holds both identities, which raises really interesting questions. When facing discrimination, which identity do they draw on for coping? Both. Does it depend if the discrimination feels racial or ethnic?
So many layers.
So many. And for educators, just understanding that race and ethnicity are distinct and that students are navigating these intersections allows you to acknowledge their experiences more accurately, more respectfully, see the whole complex child.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Theories, research, limitations, nuances. So let's wrap this up. What does this all mean for you, our listener, as you prepare to shape the next generation? What are the big takeaways?
Well, I think the clearest takeaway is that ethnic identity is it's a really powerful force in psychosocial functioning. It often acts as that protective buffer, fostering resilience, especially for ethnic minority youth. But it's
Okay.
incredibly diverse. You
Yeah.
absolutely cannot assume homogeneity, either between different ethnic groups or even within a single group. The experiences are just too varied.
Right. Context matters. Specific background matters.
Hugely. And we still have so much to learn. We need more longitudinal studies, more research on adults, more focus on the individual components, exploration, resolution, affirmation, and especially more work on how multiple identities intersect, all within different community contexts.
And for you, as an educator, you're right there on the front lines of identity development, your classroom. It can be this incredibly powerful space for positive ethnic identity formation.
We really can.
By understanding these nuances, exploration, resolution, affirmation, by being sensitive to the diverse backgrounds and contexts your students bring, you can create an environment where every single child feels seen, feels valued, feels affirmed for exactly who they are. You're helping them build that strong sense of self that can support their well-being for their entire lives.
Yeah. Which leads to, I think, a really important question for you to chew on as you move forward, something to really consider. How might you, in your own future classroom, intentionally design things, learning experiences, classroom routines, the overall culture, design them in a way that doesn't just celebrate diversity on the surface, but actively supports and strengthens each student's unique ethnic identity?
Turning it into a real source of resilience.
Exactly. Transforming it into a tangible source of resilience and well-being, something they can draw on, especially when they face the inevitable challenges society might throw their way. How can you help build that psychological armor, that inner strength right there in your classroom?